Then I need to freeze my son's access to the joint account. Years ago, when Daniel was in college, George had added him as a joint account holder to help with expenses. Daniel hadn't used it in years, but technically he still had access. The banker confirmed. Yes, we can freeze his access immediately. Any particular reason? Family matter, George said simply. But George wasn't done. He called his friend Roberto, who owned a limousine service. Roberto, I need a favor. I need a driver and a car for tomorrow evening. The nicest car you have. Roberto, confused but loyal, agreed. George then called another old friend, Frank Chen, who worked as a photographer for high society events in the Hamptons. Frank, do you know anything about the Ashford wedding tomorrow night? Frank laughed. Know about it? I'm shooting it. Biggest wedding of the season. Why? Because I'm going to be there, George said. And I need you to make sure you capture every moment. That evening, George didn't rent a tuxedo. He went out and bought one. A proper one, tailored, expensive. He bought new shoes, a silk tie, gold cufflinks. He went to a high-end barber and got styled. When he looked in the mirror the next evening, he barely recognized himself. He looked distinguished. Dignified. Like a man who belonged at a high-society wedding. At 6 p.m. on December 20th, a black limousine pulled up to George's apartment building. The neighbors stared as George, looking like $1 million, climbed into the back seat. The Ashford estate in the Hamptons, George told the driver. And take your time. I want to arrive fashionably late. The Ashford estate was everything George had imagined. A massive mansion lit up like a palace, with hundreds of luxury cars lining the circular driveway. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns streamed through the grand entrance. George's limousine pulled up to the main entrance just as the ceremony was ending and cocktail hour was beginning. As George stepped out of the car, several valets rushed over, assuming he was someone important. George walked through the front doors with his head held high. The grand ballroom was spectacular. Crystal chandeliers, ice sculptures, a string quartet playing Vivaldi. 200 guests in their finest clothes, champagne flowing like water. And there, in the center of it all, stood Daniel. His son looked handsome in his tuxedo, holding hands with a beautiful blonde woman in an elaborate white wedding dress. Victoria Ashford Martinez. Daniel was laughing at something someone said when he turned and saw his father. The blood drained from Daniel's face. His mouth fell open. Victoria noticed her new husband's expression and followed his gaze. Daniel, she said. Who is that? George walked slowly across the ballroom floor. Every step deliberate. Every eye in the room gradually turning to watch this distinguished older gentleman approaching the groom. When George reached Daniel, the entire room had gone silent. Even the string quartet had stopped playing. Hello, son, George said quietly. Surprise. I decided to come after all. Daniel's voice came out as a strangled whisper. Dad, what are you? You can't be here. Can't be here? George said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. At my own son's wedding? The wedding I paid $30,000 for. Victoria's eyes went wide. She turned to Daniel. Your father? Daniel, what is he talking about? You told me your father was deceased. You said he died when you were in college. The words hit George like a punch to the gut. Daniel had told his new wife that George was dead. Daniel's face went from white to red. He grabbed George's arm, trying to pull him away from the crowd. Dad, please, not here. Let's talk outside. But George wasn't moving. He gently removed Daniel's hand from his arm. No, Mijo. We're going to talk right here. Right now. In front of all your important friends. More guests were gathering now, sensing drama. Victoria's parents, distinguished-looking people in their 60s, pushed through the crowd. "Daniel," Victoria's father said sharply. "What's going on? Who is this man?" George turned to face him. "My name is George Martinez. I'm Daniel's father. For 50 years, I've worked as a gardener and landscaper. I raised Daniel alone after his mother died. I worked 3 jobs to send him to private school. I gave him every opportunity one never had. And 3 months ago, when he asked me for $30,000 to help pay for this wedding, I gave him everything I'd saved for my entire life. My retirement. My safety net. Everything." The ballroom was dead silent now. You could hear a pin drop. Victoria stared at Daniel in horror. "You told me you were paying for half the wedding yourself. You told me you'd been saving for years. You told me your father was dead." Daniel's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Victoria, I can explain." And then, George continued, his voice steady but full of pain, "3 days ago, my son sent me a text message. He said there was a mix-up with the guest list. He said the venue couldn't accommodate me. He forgot to reserve a seat for his own father. He took my $30,000 and decided I wasn't good enough to attend his wedding. He was ashamed of me. Ashamed of the gardener father who raised him." Victoria turned to Daniel, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Is this true? Daniel, is this true?" Daniel looked around desperately at all the faces staring at him. His colleagues. His new in-laws. Victoria's wealthy friends and family. It wasn't like that. Dad, you don't understand. These people, this world, it's complicated. I was trying to protect you from." "Protect me?" George said. "You were trying to protect yourself. You were ashamed of where you came from. Ashamed of me." Victoria's father stepped forward, his face hard as stone. "Young man, is what he's saying true? Did you tell us your father was deceased?" Daniel couldn't speak. His silence was answer enough. Victoria's mother spoke up, her voice cold. "And you took this man's life savings under false pretenses? $30,000? George pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I have the bank records right here. The cashier's check. Cashed 3 weeks ago." Victoria's father took the papers, examined them, and his face grew darker. He turned to his daughter. "Victoria, I think we need to have a very serious conversation." "No, wait," Daniel said desperately. "Please, this is all a misunderstanding." But Victoria had already pulled off her wedding ring and shoved it into Daniel's hand. "A misunderstanding? You lied to me about everything. Your father. Your finances. Who you really are. This marriage is based on lies." She turned to her father. "Daddy, I want an annulment. Immediately." The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Victoria's father put his arm around his crying daughter and led her away. Her mother followed, but not before giving Daniel a look of pure disgust. George stood there watching his son's world collapse around him. Part of him felt vindicated. Part of him felt heartbroken. Daniel turned to his father, tears now streaming down his own face. "Dad. I'm so sorry. I was stupid. I was wrong. I wanted to fit in. I wanted them to see me as successful, not as the son of a..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Not as the son of a gardener," George finished for him. "Not as the son of a working-class man who smells like grass and dirt. Not as the son of an immigrant who barely speaks English without an accent." Daniel broke down completely. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." George looked at his son for a long moment. "You know what the saddest part is, Daniel? I was never ashamed of what I do. I was proud to be a gardener. I was proud to work hard and provide for you. But you were so desperate to escape where you came from that you erased me completely. You killed me off in your story. You took everything I gave you and decided it wasn't enough to even earn you a seat at your own son's wedding. Daniel reached out, but George stepped back. I hope it was worth it, Mijo. I hope those $30,000 bought you everything you wanted. George turned and walked out of that ballroom with his head held high. Behind him, he heard Daniel collapse into sobs. He heard the whispers and the scandalized voices of 200 wealthy guests who now knew the truth about Daniel Martinez. Frank Chen, the photographer, caught George's eye as he walked out and gave him a small nod. Every moment had been captured. By the next morning, the story would be all over Greenwich and Manhattan society circles. The investment banker who lied about his dead father. The social climber who stole his gardener father's life savings. Daniel Martinez's reputation was destroyed. 3 days later, George received a wire transfer. $30,000 returned to his account. Plus interest. Plus an additional $5,000. A note came with it, handwritten. Dad, I know money can't fix what I did. I know I can never take back the pain I caused you. Victoria's family has demanded I return every penny, plus damages. The wedding has been annulled. I've lost my job. My reputation is destroyed. But I deserve all of it. I was wrong. I was ashamed of the wrong person. I should have been ashamed of myself. If you can ever forgive me, I'd like to try to earn back your respect. I'd like to try to become the son you deserved. I'm moving back to Connecticut. I'm going to start over. And if you'll let me, I'd like to learn the landscaping business. I'd like to learn what real work means. What real honor means. I love you, Dad. I'm sorry. Daniel. George sat in his small apartment, reading that letter over and over. Part of him wanted to crumple it up and throw it away. Part of him wanted to never speak to Daniel again. But George was a father. And fathers, even when their hearts are broken, still love their children. He picked up the phone and called Daniel. You can start Monday, George said. 5 a.m. Don't be late. And me, Joe? Wear old clothes. We're planting trees in the Miller estate. It's hard work. Back-breaking work. The kind of work that builds character. On the other end of the line, Daniel's voice was thick with tears and gratitude. I'll be there, Dad. I promise. I'll be there. 6 months later, Daniel Martinez was still working for his father's landscaping business. His hands were now rough and calloused. His back ached at the end of every day. He'd lost weight, gained muscle, and developed a deep tan. He drove his father's old pickup truck because he'd sold the BMW to pay back debts. He lived in a modest apartment because the penthouse was gone. His old colleagues from the investment bank didn't return his calls. His name was still whispered about in Manhattan society circles as a cautionary tale. But every evening, when the work was done, he and his father would sit on the tailgate of that old truck and eat sandwiches together. They would talk about the day, about the gardens they'd planted, about the honest work they'd done. And slowly, painfully, they were rebuilding something that had been broken. Not just a relationship between father and son. But respect. Real respect. The kind that can't be bought with $30,000 or a fancy wedding or a penthouse apartment. The kind that has to be earned, one day of hard work at a time. George Martinez never got his fairy tale moment at his son's wedding. But he got something better. He got his son back. And Daniel Martinez learned the hardest lesson of his life. That you can't erase where you came from. That shame is poison. And that the man he'd been most desperate to escape from, the gardener with dirt under his fingernails, was the most honorable man he'd ever known. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone. Sometimes revenge is about teaching them the truth. And the truth had set them both free. George Martinez was 72 years old, and his hands told the story of a lifetime. Rough, calloused, stained with dirt that never quite washed out completely. For 50 years, he'd worked as a gardener and landscaper in the wealthy neighborhoods of Greenwich, Connecticut. Every morning at 5 a.m., he'd load his old pickup truck with lawn mowers, hedge trimmers, and bags of fertilizer. Every evening at 7 p.m., he'd return home exhausted, his back aching, his clothes soaked with sweat and smelling of fresh-cut grass. But George never complained. He had a purpose. He had a son. Daniel Martinez was his entire world. After George's wife Maria died of cancer when Daniel was just 8 years old, George had made a promise at her hospital bedside. He would give their boy everything, every opportunity, every chance to escape the life of manual labor that had broken George's body. So George worked 3 jobs, sometimes 4. He mowed lawns during the day, cleaned office buildings at night, and did weekend landscaping projects for the wealthy families whose children attended the same private school as Daniel. George wore second-hand clothes and drove a 15-year-old truck, but Daniel had new textbooks, a college fund, and a spot at Fairfield Prep, the most prestigious private school in Connecticut. By 1992, Daniel was 28 years old and everything George had dreamed he would become. A successful investment banker in Manhattan. Sharp suits. A BMW. A penthouse apartment with a view of Central Park. George had never seen the apartment. Daniel always said he was too busy, always promising they'd have dinner soon, maybe next month, definitely at Christmas. But the phone calls became shorter, the visits less frequent. Still, George was proud. His son had made it. His son would never have to break his back in the sun like his father had. That was enough. Or so George thought, until that phone call in September of '92 changed everything. Daniel called on a Tuesday evening, and for the first time in months, he sounded excited. "Dad," he said, "I'm getting married. Her name is Victoria Ashford. Her family is very well connected. Old money. Very important people." George felt his heart swell with joy. His son was getting married. His Daniel was starting a family. "That's wonderful, mijo," George said, using the Spanish nickname he'd called him since childhood. "When do I get to meet her? When's the wedding?" There was a pause on the line. A long, uncomfortable pause. "The wedding is in 3 months, Dad. December 20th. At the Ashford family estate in the Hamptons. It's going to be very formal. Very high society. Black tie. About 200 guests." George didn't own a tuxedo, but he'd rent one. He'd do whatever it took. "I'll be there, son. I wouldn't miss it for the world." Another pause. "The thing is, Dad, we need some financial help. Victoria's parents are covering most of the wedding, but there are still significant expenses. The venue, the catering, the band, the flowers. I was hoping you might be able to contribute." George had $32,000 in his savings account. 50 years of careful budgeting, of never buying anything for himself, of saving every spare dollar. It was his retirement fund, his safety net, his emergency money. But this was his son's wedding. His only child. His Daniel. Without hesitation, George said, "How much do you need?" $30,000 would really help cover everything, Dad. "I know it's a lot." George didn't think twice. "I'll bring you the check this weekend." On Saturday, George drove his old pickup truck into Manhattan. He'd withdrawn $30,000 in a cashier's check, placed it carefully in an envelope. When he arrived at Daniel's building, the doorman looked at him with suspicion. George, in his worn work jacket and old jeans, didn't look like he belonged in this gleaming tower of glass and marble. "I'm here to see Daniel Martinez," George said. The doorman reluctantly called up. 5 minutes later, Daniel came down to the lobby. He didn't invite his father upstairs. They stood in the lobby, and George noticed Daniel kept glancing around nervously, as if worried someone might see them together. "Thanks for this, Dad," Daniel said, taking the envelope quickly. "This really means a lot. The wedding is going to be incredible." "Can I meet Victoria?" George asked. "Maybe we could have dinner together?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "She's really busy with wedding planning right now. But you'll meet her at the wedding, obviously. I'll send you the details. 2 weeks later, a formal wedding invitation arrived at George's small apartment. Heavy cream-colored paper with gold lettering. "Victoria Ashford and Daniel Martinez request the honor of your presence." George put it on his refrigerator and looked at it every morning. He went to a rental shop and put a deposit on a tuxedo. He bought new shoes, the first new shoes he'd bought in 5 years. He even went to a barber and got a proper haircut. He wanted to look good for his son's big day. He wanted Daniel to be proud of him. But as December 20th approached, something strange happened. George called Daniel multiple times to confirm details. What time should he arrive? Would there be assigned seating? Should he bring a gift? Daniel never answered his calls. The voicemails went unreturned. George told himself Daniel was just busy with wedding preparations. He tried not to worry. Then, 3 days before the wedding, George received a text message from Daniel. Just one line. "Dad, I'm sorry, but there was a mix-up with the guest list. We're over capacity. I forgot to reserve your seat. The venue can't accommodate any more people. I'm really sorry." George stared at his phone for a full minute, reading and rereading those words. Forgot to reserve his seat. Over capacity. Can't accommodate. His son had taken his $30,000, the money George had saved for 50 years, and now he wasn't even invited to the wedding. George's hands shook as he typed back. "Daniel, I'm your father. You can't be serious." The response came quickly. "I know, Dad, and I feel terrible. But Victoria's family has very specific expectations. The guest list is mostly business associates and their family's social circle. It's complicated. I'll make it up to you. We'll have a dinner after the honeymoon. I promise." George sat down heavily on his worn couch. The truth hit him like a physical blow. His son was ashamed of him. Ashamed of the gardener father with dirt under his fingernails and calluses on his palms. Ashamed of the old man who didn't fit into the world of investment bankers and old money families. Daniel had taken his money and erased him from the most important day of his life. For 2 days, George barely ate. He barely slept. He stared at that wedding invitation on his refrigerator. Then, on the morning of December 18th, something changed inside him. The sadness turned to anger. The hurt turned to determination. If his son thought he could take everything from George and then discard him like an old tool that had served its purpose, Daniel was about to learn a very painful lesson. George picked up the phone and called his bank. "I need to put a stop payment on a check," he told the banker. "A cashier's check for $30,000. The banker checked the records. "I'm sorry, sir, but that check was already cashed 3 weeks ago." George wasn't surprised. Daniel had wasted no time.